Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to the July Lunch and Learn. Um, hasn't July rolled around quickly, but let's crack into it. For those of you who weren't able to attend the previous month's Lunch and Learn, Megan ran that one. So I really recommend that you have a look at that. It was on engaging young people who maybe are a bit therapy resistant or not sure about how they want to engage. And really, that's kind of a good precursor to this because today I'm going to be talking about creative ways to engage those young people. So we talked a little bit about what therapy might look like with those young people in terms of how we set it up and why we do things. And today we'll be looking more at the specific modalities. So what I'll kind of be doing is touching on maybe some other modalities that you may have seen already, some kind of the classic ones. And then I'll kind of be delving into more of, I guess, like the alternatives and like ideas that you can use as an alternative. So like I said, if you haven't kind of done the one before last one, obviously like not necessary because it's just about sort of talking about clients who are difficult to engage, but maybe going back and having a look and kind of putting those two pieces together. Okay, so that's just basically what I said. So recapping from the last Lunch and Learn, so we explored, how to get people through the door, what kind of things are barriers to some young people engaging, and then basically what kind of, I guess, why that is and what sort of might be some tools that we kind of use to start off that engagement. So really that building rapport and engagement, following very much about the interest base, what we typically do see with some challenges and kind of how today we're going to be talking a little bit more about what we can do in terms of those specific therapies to really make it stick. So, when we're talking about mental health, particularly, these are some of the therapies that you might have seen. So, this is really common as well. And I think it's really important to acknowledge because when it comes to what we see with better access mental health plans, so those mental health care plans that you might see from a GP, really, when you're looking at that kind of stuff, there are some specifics around what you can and can't provide. So a lot of it is talking about CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy, DBT, which is dialectic behavior therapy, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. There we go. So they sort of, and there's a few others around like motivational interviewing and a couple EMDR. So they do sort of list out, I guess, the therapies which you have to use. And as far as I understand, that's also because, when we're looking at getting those referrals and Medicare funding them, those referrals are the ones that psychologists can accept too. So there needs to be a bit of a standard. So I guess what I want to say is a bit of a caveat around, yes, we still do use these traditional therapies. What I'll be kind of offering today is that the way that you deliver can be more adaptable to engage young people, or there are also alternatives. So it's kind of the both and. It's like you can look at other models of therapy that might be more engaging, or you can use those models to include kind of more traditional, so you're meeting those Medicare outcomes. So yeah, like I said, what we traditionally see and what people kind of think of when they, go use traditional therapies is cognitive behavior therapy. It's very standard. There's lots of evidence about it. It's been around forever. So typically this is with kind of your anxiety, depression, and what cognitive-based therapy does is, sorry, cognitive behavior therapy, what it does is it looks at kind of your like your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions. And so very much it really looks kind of and breaks that down about, how we feel. And then that might, be triggered by the thoughts or then lead to behaviors, or maybe we do a behavior and that makes us feel a certain way. And then there's thoughts. So in a nutshell, very, very huge overview, that's kind of looking specifically at that. So for example, with anxiety and depression, particularly when you're sort of looking at a milder diagnosis, that can work quite well. And that's where that evidence base kind of comes from. I'll kind of go into this as well as we talk about more of those therapeutic modalities. But what we typically tend to see here at Sisu Therapies, because we work with lots of neurodivergent young people, so lots of diagnoses of autism and ADHD, With autism, particularly, you often do have that speech and language difficulty, so receptive and expressive communication. So already, when you're talking about a talk therapy like CBT, there's lots and lots of difficulties in terms there's already some developmental kind of barriers to that being an effective therapy. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that any of these aren't going to work for young people. It's just about understanding when and why we use these. So the speech can be a really big trickiness. The other thing is just that executive functioning or dysfunctioning. It can be really hard to remember or stay focused during these. Sometimes there's lots of activities. What we often also see, particularly with CBT, is that it is very much like the name cognitive. So when you are highly distressed, it's really hard for people to access that thinking part of the brain. So the more distressed or the more like huge the emotion is, the harder it is to implement CBT. And again, it's about kind of the when and how. So I often find like after we've done some kind of base work, that's when maybe those cognitive strategies and therapies come into play. And that's actually good. But you need to get a person to the point where they can identify their feelings, which is really hard again if you're looking at autism. They have a lot of difficulty with that. So you need to get them to be able to identify a feeling, label it, and then in that moment, be calm enough to look at a strategy and put that in place. And, when you again looking at those developmental difficulties associated with autism, even when you're looking at a really high level of depression, anxiety, thinking clearly is really difficult. So it's not until we kind of progress that we start, a lot of the time here to kind of use that as a therapy modality. DBT you might have heard of, so that's dialectical behavior therapy. What a mouthful. So let's just call it DBT. DBT is kind of what's considered like the gold standard for what we sort of talk about as a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So a lot of that time, borderline personality disorder, without going into it, often stems from childhood trauma. There is a very large overlap with the symptoms of borderline personality disorder and autism, which that's a whole nother presentation in itself. But because there is that overlapping kind of things around emotional dysregulation and difficulties with relationships, sometimes people kind of take parts of DBT and they use them and they adapt them when treating, I guess, when sort of engaging people who are autistic and maybe want some more traditional therapy. I've seen particular programs and I've got like a workbook where it has been adapted. I guess when we're looking at traditional DBT, there are lots of things. There's lots of things I like about DBT, but there's also lots of things that I don't like about DBT. So the first thing about DBT when you're looking at it is you have to have a really strong commitment level. Like you have to have people, the first part is really intensive where they have to be really, really committed. Like you can't take them on essentially unless they're fully engaged and like, yes, I'm going to do this for this really long period of time. So for me, it's like, well, that's really important because it's like if anyone's that engaged in therapy, that you're going to have good outcomes. So I think that's it. So usually that comes with a level of like stability in their life, so they can do this engagement. There's lots of homework. The other thing I find really difficult about DBT is there's so many acronyms. There is just so many components and they all have different acronyms for all these different exercises. And even as a clinician who has trained in it and uses parts of it, I can't remember them all. So I find that almost overwhelming. And I think, my goodness, if someone is highly distressed, being like, which thing do I use? What do I do? And to be fair to DBT, like they have broken it up into modules. So when you are dysregulated, there's a particular part for that. But again, what we're looking at with DBT is that there's a really high language kind of component. And when I was doing the training, I sort of said to the trainer, I said, look, if we're working with young people who do have receptive or expressive language difficulties, how do we do this? And he said, well, it's not really appropriate for those people. So already I'm looking at a huge chunk of the population that I work with. And even when you're looking at a trauma-based population, often there are those developmental delays as well, particularly in language. So DBT, really great, lots of great parts of it. But again, it's thinking about the appropriateness of someone kind of committing and then being able to understand and implement that context. So, lots of really good evidence around DBT. Certainly I really enjoy parts of it, but it can be really tricky. Out of the psychotherapies, acceptance and commitment therapy tends to be my favorite. I think with all of these psychotherapies, very much they like you to do the whole thing. So it's like, this is our module, this is sort of our modality. We want you to do all of this. Don't pick and choose bits and pieces. You have to do the whole thing. So technically what I say is I'm not like a DBT therapist, I'm DBT informed or I'm ACT informed because I do like taking bits and pieces and I understand that people who are very traditional in those psychotherapies say you can't do that. The way I guess I approach that is that I very much have a specific population with certain difficulties, and just doing the whole program from like a clinical perspective, that's not going to give me the outcomes I need. However, I really like a tool in this thing and I'm going to use that tool. So I think as well, when you're looking at the way different people practice, some people really like picking and choosing, others are very much against it. But acceptance and commitment therapy, I guess I like better than cognitive behavior therapy because I feel like it's more empathetic. You know, there's a lot of that kind of compassion to yourself. There's a bit of a joke that CBT can look like you're kind of gaslighting yourself. It's just different. I just find it better, I think, for the way that I think because it's, yeah, really values based. And kind of gentle. And it still has those things that DBT has around like mindfulness. There's lots of that part, but I find it a little bit more practical. And I personally find it a little bit easier to adapt to adolescents. So they're kind of the main things. I do also practice family therapy here, which is great. I really love family therapy, but without going too much into it, really you need a lot of buy-in from the family and lots of groundwork. I just find it very difficult, you know, just in the setting we are. If you've got a whole family therapy team, really beautiful. I've seen it work. It's fantastic. It's just quite hard to do. And interpersonal therapy, your real like talking therapy. Again, we've kind of, you know, without going into it, that's really great, but you know, again, you need that language component. And that's what one of the things Megan was saying about young people who might not be engaged in therapy or might be really resistant. If you're coming in and just talking, they're already got their guard up. And I guess that's why we've used different modalities because often when young people come here, they said, I don't like therapy. I don't want to talk. Don't make me talk about my feelings. Even if you're kind of sitting and talking, they start to get their guard up. So again, when you're looking at how effective your interventions can be, it's really important to think about the young person or the person you're engaging with. That was a lot longer than I planned to spend on that, but that's okay. Oh, we've kind of touched on this, but basically why standard modalities may not work. Very much it's that verbal and cognitive load. So it can feel irrelevant to the client. Like if it's not, they don't like that part, if they don't connect with it, it's very difficult. Like let's say with CBT, if they're just not gelling with it, if you don't have the ability to kind of change path or adapt that, you often lose them. It's very workbook based in its traditional form, and that just sometimes doesn't work for clients. It's really interesting. Like, I think culturally, I certainly am not the person to talk about that, but I think it's really interesting that, like, thinking about cultural appropriateness and how to implement that. Um, yeah, so that CBT can kind of sometimes feel a bit shamey if you're not in the right headspace for it. Also, you kind of get in that cycle where people are like, well, this is the treatment. This is, you know, the therapist has given me the activities. I'm not being able to implement them. And then they're like, what's wrong with me? And it kind of can lead to a shame spiral. So again, it's about how you even implement these and the approach you take. So again, with young people as well, really cognitive. And even if we're just talking about teenagers' ability to access that thinking part of their brain because of what's going on in that developmental stage, it's just really limited. And so we're asking them to do things that are actually biologically difficult for them at that point. So, you know, you have to be really cautious about that. Click on to the next slide. Creative models. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the kind of more readily available, also more commonly known creative models, and I'll kind of then go a little bit more into details about what we do. So I will say that I certainly, I've had training in play therapy and art therapy and huge fan of sensory, but I'm not the expert. So I'm going to give a huge overview and without going into too much, you know, specifics. So I guess what I just wanted to say is with all of those modalities, particularly play therapy and art therapy, it's a huge overarching kind of title. So play therapy, there's like, there's so many different ones, like, whether we're looking at symbolic or, there's things like sand tray therapy. But also, people say, oh, I want play therapy. Often that it's not, it's just this idea of like, are we just going to let them and be expressive and do that? Is there directive? And again, different people can be very specific about what type of play therapy they do. But there is also this huge variety, which can be quite complex. Same thing with art therapy. There is like this, you can go and do like an art therapy group where the clinician or the, I suppose, the group facilitator might have very specific art activities and might be like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to, draw this or paint this. It might be like, here are the art, very much non-directive, the client kind of gets in and picks their modalities and sort of does what they want. So again, even when you're looking at these more creative models and differences, there are differences in the way people practice, and there are specific kind of, I guess, like models of those practice. So like play therapy and art therapy. As well, even with sensory approaches, there's kind of different way people use them. In terms of like, again, I won't go into it because it's a bit more nuanced, but like sensory integration versus like sensory, kind of, if we're looking at like, I guess, almost like exposure sensory integration, getting someone used to things, that's very different to like, looking at just a regulation. And I guess the reason that I really like sensory kind of particularly in this kind of creative approach is because like if you're looking at things like ACT and DBT, they have a sensory component because we know, particularly when you can't access that really crucial thinking part of your brain, your body will respond to sensation. So having something that is a sensory input is a really quick way to help your body regulate, especially when you don't have the words. So, it's very interesting, I think, as an occupational therapist, having this lovely sensory lens, and then you have these really like, traditional like DBT kind of approaches where they're talking about sensory, and OTs have been talking about that for ages. So it's like we need to kind of make sure we reclaim a little bit of that as well. Okay. Oh. Now, my PowerPoint cut off my table, so I had to try and stick it in again. It is a bit grainy, so I hope you can see that, but I will talk through that. So they're kind of your bigger standard models, and I guess they're different in creativity, and they're kind of the things people might have heard about, but certainly I don't claim to be the expert. And so if you're interested in those, I'd encourage you to look into them, maybe have a look at the different kind of types of the different schools of thought and see which one works for you. There's lots of really great training around them. I suppose what I wanted to bring today is something more about the way we do things in creativity, because lots of people ask particularly about some of our groups, which I love. And I'm going to just talk about that because the first one there is Minecraft. So we have a Minecraft group here. It's called Block Party. We typically have 3 to 4 people, young people, join. And it is absolutely fantastic. So what I'll sort of say about lots of these groups is what you want to do, and this is sometimes where those kind of traditional psychotherapies fall down, is you are always going to get the best results, particularly with young people, when you can make it in their natural environment. What we want is it for to kind of be happening for them in real time, so like with their peers in their natural environment, for those interventions to stick and those strategies. So we know from lots and lots of research that whenever we can do therapy, like in the real world, in that actual situation, you're going to have better outcomes because it is much easier to translate the therapy. And I guess that's the thing with all of these is like they're nice and really practical and involved. So Minecraft is great because you're not just having the therapist chime in and talk about, oh, let's problem solve this. You're also getting peer feedback. And when you're looking particularly at that adolescent age group, peers are number one. You've got all the adults over here, you've got teachers and parents and your therapist, like they're telling you things, but adults don't know anything. But when you have feedback from your peer, that's really valuable. And adolescents really, really value that. So you are increasing their ability to learn in real time. And I guess as well, it can seem really simplistic with like a Minecraft group. It's like, oh, you've picked 4 kids and you're going to jump on for an hour and play Minecraft. It can look like that from the outset, but what goes into that in the background, I guess what is different if we're doing a Minecraft therapy group versus like a social group that might be run. Both valid, but a therapy group, we've, worked with that young person. It might not us specifically, like it might be someone else in the practice, but we know the young person's goals. We know their chronological age, but also their developmental age. It's really important when doing groups that you not only match up their ages, but also look at their stages and developmental kind of age in certain areas. So, and also just their personalities, like if it's lots of loud kids or quiet kids, you just have to make sure that the group kind of works together. And that's not to say you're going to have all exactly the same type of kid, but it's just being really mindful that you want this to be a therapeutic opportunity. And so thinking about that and being really careful about who joins in on that is really important. So when we do that, we kind of, we think about the kids. So we think about what their goals are, what the therapist wants to get out of them, get out of the session, sorry, get out of them. And then we kind of go from there. And so Minecraft is really good in terms of, the young people who we do have an interest in Minecraft. They like it. So already there's a buy-in because it sounds fun, doesn't sound like traditional therapy. But what you're doing is we've created these activities where you're looking at social learning, so that real-time feedback from peers. You've got executive functioning, so they've got to concentrate, they've got to plan, they've got to problem solve. You've got that emotional regulation. What happens if something blows up or someone knocks something over? Or, for me, I accidentally whacked someone's animal because I can't play Minecraft and I tried, but accidentally hit someone's axolotl and I felt terrible. But how do we regulate when these things happen? And also just talking through that really lovely kind of narrative experience. And so the therapist is there to kind of jump in when needed and kind of take a step back and let the young people work. But then kind of still be involved from a therapeutic point of view about like reflection or kind of talking about things. And then we also give feedback to the other therapists. So if it's not our client, be like, hey, little Johnny went to Minecraft today and this is what we saw and this worked really well. And, how does this look in therapy? So again, really simplistic from the out view, but a lot goes into it. So it's really nice. I really like the Minecraft group. It can be quite stressful for me because I don't play Minecraft. I've had to learn, and pretty much most of the group is me falling down hills and dying or accidentally smacking things or just, but again, it's that thing where you can lean into it. Like I fully acknowledge the kids. I'm like, okay, Hannah doesn't know how to do things, so let's be nice to Hannah. And it's kind of fun. You sort of are engaging them on their level. In a way that's really practical. And it's like, yeah, lean into that. You don't have to be the expert, and you're also inviting kids to like explain it to you and engage you. All of a sudden they have that power role. And in therapy, that's really important to think about. So it's like they're kind of guiding it. It doesn't feel like traditional therapy. One of my huge favorites is my Dungeons and Dragons group. We have discussed in the group now. I technically can't call it Dungeons and Dragons because I don't follow the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, if you haven't played before, has a lot of rules and they're very specific and I don't follow them. But again, this is actually part of the therapy then, because I'll sometimes have young people be like, yes, it is online. We did offer as well to have in person, but no one's kind of done it. But it gets quite chaotic, so I'm glad it's online. But that's also the other thing is then kids from all around, anywhere, they're all our clients. But theoretically, you could then have kids in rural communities able to join in and do these therapies, which is fantastic. Yeah, so Dungeons and Dragons is very much, it's like, what do we call it now? Tabletop role-playing game. So that's what it is. It's not Dungeons and Dragons because Hannah doesn't follow the rules and she makes things up as she goes, which is part of the therapy of challenging. If someone's really like, that's not what happens, I'm like, it's what Hannah's doing. So again, it's like all of a sudden, and I'm regulating people as part of that, and we talk about that before we start. I'm like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing here, so I'm going to make it up as I go. But it's that really lovely narrative. And the thing I like about Dungeons and Dragons is you create this story. And again, you're looking at the client and their goals and kind of what we want to do. And you can then create these challenges or this story where you're talking about different parts of it. Like what is it that we want to happen? How can we create the challenges that maybe people are having in real life? And how can we kind of link that in? And that's really that beautiful kind of narrative therapy component. And again, you've got these really nice kind of like it is shared problem solving. So if you haven't played, I'm not going to butcher the explanation of Dungeons and Dragons, but essentially it's like a story and you all are characters and you come across different challenges, lots of often battles. It usually has a fantasy component and you basically roll the dice to see whether or not you're successful in something. So there's a lot of things around like if you get a bad roll, you have to regulate, but also you're as a little team doing things and you often can't progress or beat the monster or whatever unless you're working as a team. And so all of a sudden, again, your peers, it's really, really tricky because you like in a good way, like it's challenging because you have to come together and work as a team. So I really love it because when I started it, I'd never played Dungeons and Dragons before. I've done one campaign where I was participating basically to learn about it. It was run by another therapist, and we were all therapists, so it was very interesting. There was lots of what would you like to do, and kind of very therapist-y things. It was quite funny, but like some of the things that just happen are hilarious, and I think rapport building, it's great. You can really relax. I'll talk about it a bit more in the next slide, but it is one of my favorite things that I've ever done. It's so amazing. Play therapy we kind of touched on, but really I think play therapy, I'm kind of going to talk about it as well, and myths about stuff, but kids play. That's how they express themselves. That's how they work through. Developmentally, that's appropriate. So it's really safe. And it's safe because you can also project, like it's not me, it's a doll that's doing this. And, it's very good to engage, particularly younger people. Sometimes, again, I'll sort of going to talk about it now, but sometimes we're like, oh, they just need to talk about it. Language isn't developed like that, particularly in young people. So you need to give them a way that's really gentle that you can help them express those things. So another one that I really, really love is animal assisted therapy, which he's snoring on the floor. Hugo was going to make an appearance, but he apparently doesn't want to get up on the couch. I've got lots of cute photos of them next. But with animal assisted therapy, basically, I know there's lots of different types. I just tend to use my dogs. I've got two Frenchies. If you haven't seen our website or anything before, Hugo and Gaston are our very beautiful little Frenchies. And in terms of one of the best therapies I've ever invested in, hands down, animal assisted therapy and probably Dungeons and Dragons are the things that I've seen the best outcomes from, and sensory stuff too. I'll throw that in there. But there is just this really lovely thing about, and lots of great research about as soon as you have a dog in there, just people's cortisol just drops. So that's stress hormone. So they're more likely to feel comfortable. They're more likely to engage with you to the point where sometimes you have to like say, look, you're feeling really, they're like talking. They're like, oh, wow, I'm talking about a lot of this stuff. You're like, yeah, it's because the dog's here and you're really relaxed. That's really normal. It's okay. You kind of have to tell people that, it's all right. It's the dog. He's tricked you into talking to me. As well, it's a nice kind of intro. Kids will kind of be like, I don't want to see you, but I want to see your dog. And I'm like, I don't care. Yeah, go play with my dog. That's fine. Gets kids in the door. They're great for modeling. It's like, Gaston is this crazy little Frenchie who likes to jump and play and is just so great then for our kids with, particularly when you're looking at autism and ADHD, just that 0 to 100 real quick. It's like, oh, Gaston's overstimulated. What can we do to calm him down? And you're not specifically it's that nice indirect way of talking about how we regulate. Dogs are kind of very good at like you can kind of read their body language. They kind of are a bit expressive. You can talk about how they think and feel. And just even having a little dog lay on you, it's just so nice and relaxing. So it's just this really beautiful engagement tool. And again, I've got lots of people in the door where it's like, I don't like her, but she's got a dog. It's like kind of gives you credit. It's like, well, if you've got a dog, you've got to be an okay person. So I really, really like that. I just think as an engagement tool, having this little dog as like a distraction or like a little safe person, it just helps that connection. Just take a drink because I'm talking lots. Okay, so sensory modulation. Again, that's a really huge topic. I can't remember I think we're doing it later in the year, so I won't get too much into it because it's something we get a lot about. But I think, yeah, again, on the next slide, I've got a picture of our sensory room. But really what I like about this is, as I've said before, cognitive strategies are hard. You know when you're really distressed, doesn't matter who you are, you will feel things really like things start to irritate you if you're feeling really sensitive. But also, we naturally do as humans things to regulate our nervous system through our senses. Some people like a deep hug. Everyone, not everyone, like, weighted things are really popular. We might have low lighting. Do we wear some headphones? Noise canceling those little loops are really popular. And it's all that kind of stuff. It's naturally as humans, we want to regulate. And even, developmentally again, when you're looking at younger children, that's how it starts regulating. You have the touch and the rocking and, soothing voice. As humans, as soon as we kind of get stressed and we go down those levels in our brain, we're dropping down developmental levels. I mean, not practically, you're still an adult, but you sometimes feel like throwing a tantrum. Like that's what we're talking about. And it's like, okay, let's take a step back and help regulate. And once I'm regulated, then I can talk about it. And that's where the sensory component comes in, is people come in and they're not ready to talk about it, or they might want to talk about it, but they get really dysregulated. And so then you can put those sensory kind of interventions in place, and it might help people feel comfortable to talk, or that might be teaching them about their body. And, emotions often are expressed in our bodies as feelings. So how do we use that, and how can we add those strategies? And so often I'm starting with sensory strategies first, because once someone is able to calm themselves, understand their feelings, that's when you can use sort of more cognitive things around reflection and kind of, after the event, what happened and what was my triggers. But you have to be regulated first. And that's this really beautiful component of where it kind of comes in. The other thing I really love, I did like sensory and attachment intervention, which again, whole nother thing, but just that idea that, there is a really beautiful thing that kind of happens between humans when that's sensory regulation. And if we're looking again developmentally, parent and child, that's where those relationships start to develop. So it's a really, really powerful kind of modality for helping build connection as well. And last, this is for the OTs, ADL is therapy. So particularly, I said ADL, I meant to write just occupations, stuff. So it is a means and an ends is what we talk about. So when we're looking, particularly when we're looking really practically at like NDIS, often people have really practical goals around like what they want to do and that kind of stuff. So sometimes it's really nice to, like, if young people particularly don't want to engage in talk therapy, it's like, okay, well, what matters to you? What's important? Oh, buttering toast is always a thing. Like, I just want to be able to make myself a piece of toast. It's like, cool, okay, well, that's important to you. Let's do that. And that's really great because we're targeting all those skills around like their fine motor and planning or your executive functions, something important to them, and it's linked to their independence. And we're not forcing them to talk, but we're saying, hey, I listen to you. I value what you've got to say and what you want to do. And you're working on lots of other little bits and pieces with it. And in the same way, that's why we also do use like games, or we'll like maybe do some cooking if that's what the young person loves, or like craft, that activity, those occupations, those leisure occupations. People are going to be interested because they really like them, and they're going to be more relaxed because they're doing the thing they love. So it's this really nice thing where we're kind of doing real world stuff, but we're working on lots of those individual developmental components as well. So I've talked a little bit about the common misconceptions. One we get a lot, and I'm sure lots of occupational therapists have heard it, is they're just playing. I come over, I drop my kid off for an hour at the OT and they just play the whole time. Yeah, we do play. But as I was sort of saying, it really is that developmentally appropriate kind of intervention for young people. That's how they express themselves. But the other thing is, even though we might just look like they're playing games for an hour, the occupational therapist has gone away and they've thought about, okay, what are the goals? Are we working on emotional regulation? Great. What are some goals that might challenge that? All right. Okay. I'm going to play these. Sorry. What are some games that might challenge that? Right. So I'm going to pick these games because I know that might be a little bit tricky. And so the young person might get a little bit upset, but not too upset. So I can practice helping them regulate in the moment. Or are we working on social stuff? Is this game interactive? So again, there's lots of those little tiny kind of thoughts that you don't see, when you come and you just see the games. But behind the scenes, there's lots of that planning and thinking about the goals, and they're very purposeful. Also, just if you've ever tried to get a kid in and talk and do something they don't want to, at the end of the day, they just don't. You know, it's that thing where if they're engaged through play, and I have a really classic example. So, my daughter was seeing an occupational therapist, and one of the things, I mean, I not overly care about the handwriting, but the handwriting obviously came up. When they brought out a sheet of paper where you just had to practice the letter A over and over again, she'd just sit under the desk and she wouldn't do anything for the hour. So then we had an hour where she was just like, I'm not doing a sheet of your A's. But when we engaged her in play, and particularly, she would be doing an activity and then it'd be like, oh, can you write a letter to, I can't remember. It's like, oh, how about you write a sign for your door or write a letter for this? And all of a sudden she was practicing her writing. And it probably looked like we were just doing play, but all of a sudden we've gone from a sheet that she wouldn't engage in to writing all this stuff and wanting to do things and being really practical. And I guess that's the difference is, we might bring worksheets and really classic examples. Doesn't mean they're going to engage at the end of the day. NDIS doesn't fund art therapy or animal assisted therapy. I can't remember where they are on art therapy. They change all the time. But yes, we are mindful, but what people are coming to see me specifically for is not art therapy or animal assisted therapy. They're coming to see me as the therapist, and I happen to use that as the modality. So I might use art and I will always use animal assisted therapy, but it's not what you kind of get charged for. It's like a thing that I do as part of being a therapist. I'm using you coming to see me as the therapist, and I just happen to have a dog because I know the good outcomes. And look, that's a whole nother argument around that kind of stuff. But again, it's more that I'm using as art as a therapist and thinking about that really practically. And so it is a little bit different because, yeah, I do get some parents like, oh, you're still doing groups, with Minecraft games aren't in. I'm like, yeah, they're not, but we're working on therapy goals. This is a therapy group, and I just happen to be using Minecraft because that's the best way to get outcomes. Traditional therapy must look like talk therapy. Yep, have it a lot. Really tricky, particularly in trauma. People like, come on, go talk to, go talk to Hannah about what happened. That's really difficult to do. There's lots of kind of that sort of stuff around, how safe do you feel? Are you able to access that? Also with trauma, we're talking about things that might not be in what we call explicit memory. So they might not necessarily remember all the parts of it, might be that kind of implicit memory. So their body is reacting. So saying, oh, you need to come in and talk about it, that's really difficult for people to do. And some people are able to get there, and sometimes it takes people a lot longer, but you can't just come in and sit down. And I will also say that's the really hard thing about Medicare referrals is it's like you have 10 sessions. And it's like if you have a young person who doesn't trust you or really needs a lot of rapport building, by the time you get to the 10 sessions, you might have only just started talking about stuff because that's what they needed. And that doesn't mean that those other 9 sessions weren't therapeutic. You needed those to get to the 10 session where they're talking. But I think that's the really tricky part. And something we really grapple with is like when we're time limited and people don't fit the mold of that 10 sessions, it can be really tricky. And I think that's just something you have to have a talk to about people when they come and engage. Oh, that really classic as well, social skills groups. So we don't run social skills groups in their traditional form. We don't come in and be like, this is what eye contact is. When someone does small talk, you nod and say yes. We don't do that because we're a neurodiverse affirming clinic. And what we know is that from people who went through those classic social skills groups is that they learnt to do things, but it wasn't a real engagement. They didn't care. They weren't listening to what the other person was saying because they were like focusing on the eye contact. The whole time they were like, do I talk about my thing? What are they talking about? It just wasn't real learning. It just made them burnt out and kind of made like a lot of shame about who they were. So we don't do that. We do lots of groups where they're around other like neurodiverse people. And so all of a sudden it's really beautiful when you have this group of people who are like, oh, you're info dumping about dinosaurs. I love info dumping about dinosaurs. And it's a different way of communication. That doesn't mean it's any less. It's just different. And giving people the opportunity to kind of communicate in their preferred way is really powerful. And I think that's one of the things I really like about groups. So here's real world examples just with my cute dogs, basically. So the first one is my Dungeons and Dragons group. And I guess one of the things that I just like to talk about in terms of experience is that I have a lot of kids who I'm like, oh, that's an introverted kid. I get that happens. And then you put them in this Dungeons and Dragons group and they absolutely come out of their shell. They're like different people. And it's really powerful to see because it's like, oh, they're so into it. It's so beautiful. Like just having them be able to engage in that kind of stuff and just really social. And as a therapist, like I've been seeing them for years and they've never been like that with me. And it doesn't matter that they trust me. It's like all of a sudden you've unlocked all this cool stuff and it's so powerful. And that real sense of community and team is just really, really wonderful. Um, and so the one in the middle with Hugo with the snacks, that's Hugo comes along to the Dungeons and Dragons. But also what it is, it's again, it's not just the group. It's like I've created a little community. So when they come in, it's after school. I always have snacks. I try and have some minties for some sensory regulation. But even then again about the group, it's about like I have a young person who was in the group for a while who had a lot of difficulty around like body dysmorphia and eating was really difficult. A lot of young people really struggle with eating in front of other people. And so all of a sudden normalizing, like I'd get it on the chips, like having that, like it's normal, like they felt comfortable in that setting to do it. And it was kind of, it was a nice community thing. We had food and, little dog is trying to steal half the chips. It's kind of that idea that just like you can weave in lots of other lovely therapies. Um, the beautiful photo down the bottom with Gaston, that little person, was shared with permission. So it's actually not a client. That's a sibling of a client who comes in, and Gaston and this little person have the best relationship. We call them best friends because they're like, yay. But just Gaston will get down in his level and kind of look and give little sniffs. And it's just this lovely engagement. It's just so beautiful when you see the dogs. Just the way they engage and just, when you like they pick up on the stress, so they'll go over and they'll cuddle them. And I mean, it's almost bad because sometimes I can tell when people are stressed out because the dogs will be like creeping over, and I'm like, okay, this is causing you some anxiety. The dog just ran over to you. But again, it's also nice because someone might not have noticed that they were feeling really stressed, and all of a sudden this little dog's like, muscling up to them and be like, hi. So it's like, oh yeah, actually this is something really difficult to talk about. Um, but yeah, just beautiful Gaston little person, just such lovely engagement. Down the bottom as well, that's our sensory room, Hugo snoring, just really lovely space to come in and just sometimes you do feel overstimulated talking about things. So it's like, okay, here's a really safe space where we can kind of express ourselves. Um, that is Gaston. The one down the bottom there is Gaston laying on my picture of him. It's a portrait of him. It's lovely. Again, that is one of the examples of it was kind of non-directive art. Basically, a young person really wanted to come in and paint, and I was like, "Yep, cool, that's fine." And I was talking as well about like what I was doing with the paint. So the young person I was working with, we were kind of focusing more on developmental goals. So I'm actually in the assessment phase with them. And I picked painting because firstly, it's what they wanted to do. We're very early on in the relationship, the therapeutic relationship. So I wanted them to want to come to therapy. I wanted them to be engaged. But all of a sudden, when we're doing art stuff, it's like I could see their fine motor and I could see their attention, like their working memory. So I'd weave in things like, I wanted to see how they went with like directions. I'd be like, okay, can you pass me the pink paint and the purple paint and the orange paint? So that's three things they had to keep in mind. And then I'd see what they did. And then as well, like how they planning, like what are they going to do? How like long can they engage in this activity? I modeled a few things. Do they copy? So there's so much involved. So yes, from the outside, someone's like, oh, she did painting for an hour. I did, but I got so much from that assessment. And, there are, and they're important standardized assessments, but it's like draw a line, copy a circle. Whereas when I'm doing this, I might be like, oh, wow, can you help me draw a tree? And let's do the circles on the tree. And, oh, I'm really having trouble doing this. Or can you help me cut this out? And again, you're getting all that great information for an assessment and working out what you want, but it's so much richer. And you can also, talk about your day. I can't remember. I was like, oh, do you like art at school? And the kid was like, yeah, it's okay. And, oh, I've got this teacher and I'm doing this in art. And, you know, just such a wealth of information. And again, that's really like, in that particular instance, it was like occupation was the means, kind of like it wasn't, the ends. Oh gosh, I can't remember. Anyway, it was like I got lots of information from it. He was engaged. He didn't know I was assessing him for like his fine motor and stuff. But yeah, it was really interesting because I got a lot more out of seeing him in a real world environment where he wanted to do that. And lastly, just the Minecraft group. I've just talked about that. Like it's just really fun. Like you do have to direct the kids a little bit because it's like so stimulating, but it's also really great because it's like they have to negotiate. It's like, I want to do this today. Well, I want to do this. Okay, well, how can we do both? And again, it's like that rule thing. Like a lot of times young people have like a difficulty with losing games. It's like it's very different when you see it with peers. And, there might be a kid who comes in and kind of like, tries to cheat or bend the rules with us. But then it's like if you've got your peers there, seeing that as really different, or do you have to do teamwork? Lots of times, can we gang up on the therapist? And it's like, yep, that's a classic. So this is certainly not everything, but this is just some ideas about, I guess, how you can engage different therapies to use it. So yeah, like I said, we get lots of questions, especially from other therapists, like, how do you do Dungeons and Dragons? So I've only just touched on that, but yeah, it is just one of the most wonderful tools. So what I would say is if you have an interest, whether it be art, or there's lots of therapists who do really beautiful outdoor stuff, we do yoga. If you have an interest, I think it's really worth exploring because it also brings like a bit of your personality and it kind of helps in terms of connection. So I definitely look at exploring things. And I think as well, it's really nice when people might be like, why are you doing that? Thinking about, okay, why am I doing that? And as therapists as well, that's really good. One of the things I've definitely gotten better at, which I still struggle with, is sometimes I have to explain to parents by, let's say, oh, lose my voice. Like if we've done Lego for an hour, it's like, okay, so this is what I was working on, this is what I was assessing. Sometimes we do have to practice as therapists as well of like explaining that because, otherwise parents are like, why are you doing that? It's interesting because we are very careful that with our like Medicare sessions, because sometimes when it is that really slow burn around the rapport, we kind of like ethically, we talk about it, like we kind of have to let parents know because therapy might not progress how we would want it to in terms of the time. But, again, particularly when you're looking at, young people who don't want to engage in therapy, at the end of the day, having a safe relationship with someone and a good experience of therapy, that is a really important therapeutic outcome, and that is the therapy. And we know as well there is a huge, huge kind of like a lot of the reasons therapies work is because that of therapeutic rapport and that relationship you have with the client, that is a lot of the time the therapy. So if unfortunately, like if you're going to try and make them do something they don't want to, you're not going to get the gain because you don't have that therapeutic relationship. And that is actually one of the most important things when you're looking at doing therapies and having it be successful. So that's my little spiel. So wrap up and questions. So I think Megan usually turns off the recording for questions. But if there are and they're really interesting, we'll put them in the transcript. But for now, I'm going to turn off the recording and yeah, still having time for some more questions, just working out how I am. See, yeah, I'd lean into like not being able to do any of this tech stuff.